told that you'll like to start and finish the same day, so which means I've got to get through 200 slides before midnight. So I'm going to gallop through these, and you might find that most slides only have a bullet point or two. Anybody trying to read the text on my slides, I think it's best you look at the recorded version. Okay, that seems to be working. So I'm going to get through a few preliminaries, then I'm going to introduce the physical context for Sri Lanka, and then in the bulk of the presentation, we'll look at cetaceans and whale watching, and finally wrap up with the top wildlife sites and some of the endemic birds we're going to encounter on a trip there. I'd like to thank some of the photographers who contributed images. All the images are not mine. Also, I would like to say a big thank you to various corporate supporters, without whose support it would have been very difficult for me to work on the stories I have done. And also a big thank you to the publishers who have given me a voice. So let's start by looking a little bit about where Sri Lanka is. So it's to the southeast of India, but the key point here is that just being near the equator by itself doesn't mean it's going to be lush and biodiversity rich. If you look to your left, you can see the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, which are very dry and desert-like. So it's a combination of topography, monsoons, and various other planetary scale factors which really determine how a destination, how diverse it will be. So Sri Lanka has a central mountainous core. There are 2 monsoons, and the effect of this is that there is a southwestern region which is very wet. So Sri Lanka is next to India, which results in rain shadow, and this creates a very varied climate. So we have a very wet southwest and then very dry elsewhere. So which means across a small island, you have a combination of habitats from wet to dry, very wet in the southwest where the lowland rainforests are. But outside the southwest, although it's dry, you have a lot of action with a lot of the big game being present there. What I'm trying to show here is the species density per unit area, which in Sri Lanka is surprisingly high. So on the left graph, I'm showing a hypothetical situation where you have a number of islands, and as the size increases, you expect the number of species to continue to increase. And the graph on the right shows that if you look at it as species per unit area, you'll find that it's pretty much the same. So if you look at the big islands like Madagascar, Borneo, and New Guinea, which are also tropical, and they're about 600,000 square kilometers, around 10 times the size of Sri Lanka, you find that the species per unit area for a lot of the groups are similar. So you would expect Sri Lanka to be less, being a small island. But as this graph shows, surprisingly, the red bar, which is Sri Lanka, is very much higher, which is quite unexpected. And that's because there are lots of different factors which create this super richness. So there are physical factors. So you have things like the fact that it's an island of continental origin. You have, it's been ancient and isolated for some time. You have the monsoons, you have the mountain ranges, and then you have the deep seas close to shore, but the seas connecting it with the mainland is shallow. And then you have evolutionary factors like intermittent land-bridge connections. And then in terms of making it rich for big game, you have human factors, such as the ancient civilizations which created some of the conditions we see today. Now, it's obviously going to take too much time to go into all of the details, but if anybody wants to read up more, if you just search on the internet for why Sri Lanka is super rich for wildlife, you'll find something, a 24-page document, which is online, which I've created. So if you look at Sri Lanka as a complete package, it's probably unsurpassed. But if you look at it in terms of line item, for big game, the East Africa and South Africa will be better. There are bigger rainforests in the neotropics and South Asia. There's better whale watching elsewhere, and so on. But what's special about Sri Lanka is that it's got all of this packed into one place, including a good tourism infrastructure and good guides. So let's kick off with the whale watching bit. So when we talk about marine mammals, there's more than one sort of scientific order of mammals. You have the carnivora and the cetacea and the sirenians, which include things like the dugong. But in terms of the whales and dolphins, the cetaceans, worldwide, there are about 90 species. Some families are restricted to particular regions. Sri Lanka has 27 or 28 cetacean species recorded. Doesn't mean that you're going to see that many when you go there, because some are quite rare and they're only scattered records. And if you look at this table for the 27 cetaceans, which are widely accepted, you can see I've bold-faced only just a few of the ones that tourists do encounter. There are 3 places where you can go whale watching from. On the northwest, you have the Kalpitiya Peninsula, the little finger sticking out on the left, or the first of the 2 finger-like projections you see. Then in the south, you have Dondra. Mirisa is where you really sail out from. These 2 sites are very good because the continental shelf pinches in close to shore. So you have deep water and the upwellings, which create food, which brings the whales and pelagic fish closer in. In the northeast, you have Trincomalee, which is very good because there's a submarine canyon which cuts in. Now, Mirisa, the favored destination, is in the south, and where I'm showing maps, if I can show Colombo as well, which you see on the top left, I will show that as well as a point of reference, because you generally fly into Colombo. The encounter rates from Mirisa are exceptionally high. And here I've sort of taken 1,183 sailings, and I have looked at the number of times a cetacean has been encountered. And it's an astonishing 98% of the time. The table below shows the ones you're most likely to encounter. And the surprising thing is that the blue whale, which is one of the hardest animals in the world to see, is the one that's easiest to see off Sri Lanka, followed by spinner dolphins. So here I'm trying to show how good the encounter rate is for blue whales. So this is a story I broke in 2008 that Sri Lanka was best for blue whale. But over the years, I began to collect data just to substantiate it when I was having discussions with media and film crews, etc. Now, in a sense, it's best to ignore the best month for a year or the second best month, and instead look at the third best month, because you could have a month where you go out 5 times and you see blue whale 5 times, so your encounter rate is 100%. In the graph below, I show in red the third best month in each of these years, and you can see that the encounter rate is over 80%, which explains why the blue whale, which is one of the hardest animals to see, has now become one of the easiest if you visit Sri Lanka. Okay, so going a little bit into the biology behind the whales. So there are 2 broad groups, what are called the baleen whales, which only has a handful of species, and these are the very large whales that like the blue whale, humpback, minke whale, etc. And you have the toothed whales. So the baleen whales are these baleen plates, or plates that they use to sieve food through. And toothed whales, as the name suggests, have teeth. One of the key differences is that in the baleen whales, they have two blowholes, which you can just about make out in this picture. And it's more clear on the picture on the left. And when they dive, they will close the blowholes. And on the picture on the right, you can see a blue whale that's underwater, and it has closed the air intake so that water doesn't enter its nostrils. With the toothed cetaceans, they just have one blowhole, which you can see in the spinner whale, spinner dolphin on the top. And down below is a sperm whale, which, being a toothed whale, has only one blowhole. Interestingly, on the picture on the bottom right, you can also see patches of skin flaking off, which is quite handy for scientists who collect it for doing DNA analysis. Now with birds, if you're going to tell one species apart from another, you often need to understand things like the feather topography, know what's a primary feather or a secondary or lesser coverts and things like that. When you're looking to identify cetaceans, you need to approach things differently. So you're often looking at things like the dorsal fin and the tail fin and shapes. So these are some slides which I produced to help the whale watching boats in the early days, when they didn't even realize that you could see both blue and sperm whales off Sri Lanka, and they weren't aware of the difference. So one of the things you look for is the shape of the dorsal fin. With the large whales like the blue and the sperm, the differences are very obvious. With other whales, the differences can be subtle. So the blue whale has a very short, stubby dorsal fin, whereas the sperm whale, it's nice and rounded. The tail is something else you look at, especially with the baleen whales. So in the blue whale, it's broad and triangular. The sperm whale, it's a narrow triangle, and there's a deep notch coming down the middle here. The outline is also different. In the blue whale, it's smooth outline. In the sperm whale, there are sort of knuckles or serrations at the top. The shapes look different. The blue whale looks very sort of like a fat sausage. Sperm whale looks longer, and it's got a very wrinkled body. But shape can be deceptive depending on your viewing angle. So here you can see, it's the same species of blue whale around Sri Lanka, but in these different images, whether you call them sort of like a short fat sausage or something longer will vary on your perspective. There are also other things that you begin to notice. The blue whales have remoras or suckerfish quite often on their body and the dorsal fins, or around the dorsal fin and on the tail fin. In the sperm whale, they're absent, and this is probably because sperm whales dive to 2 to 3 kilometers, and remoras will probably be crushed to death. There are also behavioral differences. The blue whales around Sri Lanka fluke up 90% of the time. They just say their tail sort of projects up before they start a feeding dive. In Baja California, they do this only once in 10 times. As to why the differences rise, well, it's hard to know. Okay, let's now look at a selection of the whales and dolphins you see around Sri Lanka. So the top drawer is the blue whale. It's the largest animal that has ever lived on the planet, bigger than any dinosaur. And as I mentioned before, astonishingly, the easiest to see off Sri Lanka. You also have the bride's whale, which is considered a tropical whale. The way to identify it decisively is if you can see the 3 dorsal ridges, but this is not always easy to see when you're whale watching. But what you do notice is that the fin is different. It's sickle shaped. And once you get your eye in, it's quite easy to identify a bride's whale. The color is, the skin color is also smoother, and it lacks the mottling seen in blue whales. The humpback whale is actually quite rare. People claim they have seen a humpback whale because sperm whales and other whales hump their back before they dive, and they think, oh, that must mean it's a humpback whale. So So these were actually taken by me in Boston, USA, because humpbacks are very rare, and with some other people, we wrote a paper on the small number of confirmed sightings in Sri Lanka. It's like the blue whale. You can see the tall vertical blow, but the tail flukes, again, if you look at it, are very distinctive with the sort of pointed edges and the serrations, which the other whales don't have. Also, in front of the eye, on top of the head, you can see these tubercles or protuberances, which are quite obvious. You don't always see the long white pectoral fins that it's famous for. So moving on to the other group of whales, the toothed cetaceans, which is in the suborder Odontocetes. The biggest is the sperm whale. Males can come in at 60 metric tons. Being big is not necessarily best, because they are hunted by the orcas or killer whales, which are, I guess, instantly recognizable with their characteristic black and white patterns. They also have these paddle-shaped pectoral flippers, which gives them great maneuverability as a hunter. The males are often characterized by very tall vertical dorsal fins. They also have unique identification patterns, which helps you to identify them fairly easily down to individual level. And there's a story behind this picture. Marianne Taylor, whom many of you will know as one of the most prolific British travel writers, was speaking to me after she had been on a second media visit to Sri Lanka. And she told me about an encounter with orcas, and she sent me images. And I was surprised that nobody had mentioned this to me. And I realized how some of these orca sightings could be lost. I was also curious to find out with the waters around Britain, whether the orcas you see, is it just one pod, or are there different individuals coming and from where? I had been keeping records of reliable sightings of orcas. So I emailed a bunch of people, and I updated that. And I asked Georgina Jamel, who'd spent 6 months studying orcas in Canada, to take on a photo ID project. She's done an enormous amount of work, and she's identified 39 individuals. And there are some interesting stories coming out of this. And one is as a pair that's seen regularly. They've also been seen off the United Arab Emirates in the Gulf of Arabia. So it just shows how much these orcas are traveling. And when Sri Lankans see orcas, they may not realize that these guys have traveled so far. Online, you will find this Orca Project Sri Lanka catalog. And here's an example of a page showing the individuals and the resightings. Looking very different to the killer whale is the false killer whale, very sort of boring black all around with a blunt head, doesn't have that charismatic two-tone pattern that the orca has. It can be confused with similar species like the pygmy killer whale and the melon-headed whale. And if you get a rare opportunity like this, you can actually see the kinked pectoral flippers, which help to identify this one. You also come across short-finned pilot whale in small pods. In this species, the adult males are quite distinctive because they have this very broad base triangular fin. Looks very, in the pilot whales, the dorsal fin looks very different to the other dolphins, which have a more triangular fin like the rhesus here. The rhesus dolphin is quite rare in Sri Lanka. And when you do see them, you notice that the juveniles have the natural gray sort of skin color. And the adults often are almost white due to scarring from combat with other males. The Indo-Pacific humpback dolphin is more of an Indo species, sort of in-show. and you see it in the estuaries. The Kalpiti Peninsula is the best place, but it's there's heavy traffic from fishing boats, and many of the individuals I have seen there sadly show evidence of bad encounters with boats and sport cuts and bruises. So this is quite a threatened species in Sri Lanka. The bottlenose dolphin has been split into two species. The Indo-Pacific bottlenose is more of an inshore species, and you often see it when you're leaving Mirissa Harbour. The common bottlenose tends to be found further out, and this is the same species you see in the UK. Both are very similar, and both share that characteristic bottlenose. Fraser's dolphin is much more rare, but very distinctively patterned with broad black stripes. And the spinner dolphin is everybody's favorite. This is the most commonly encountered of the dolphins. It's very lively, very acrobatic. You often see them in large pods. It's not unusual to see 500. And occasionally you come across super pods with over 2,000. On one boat trip, by measuring their speed and the timing, I estimated that one pod stretched out across 2 kilometers. The pan-tropical spotted dolphin often mixes with the spinner. You can tell them apart from a pale tip to the beak. And if you look carefully, you don't have that stripe from the eye to the flipper and the eye to the anus. If I go back, so you can see in the spinner, you have these stripes that leave the eye and go towards the front or pectoral flippers and towards the anal region. The striped dolphin is another very active and engaging animal, which can be quite acrobatic. I'm not going to go through all the 27 species, but one of the books I did with John Beaufort Publishing was to have all but Remoras whale featured in it. But because Sri Lanka lacked a pocket portable photographic field guide, I also sourced images from 41 photographers to show some of the other mammals that you can see in Sri Lanka as well. So now we move on to another section of the talk where we look at the surface behavior, and it's also sort of a whale watching glossary. So aerial behavior or breaching is when an animal sort of leaves the water. Some of this is obviously behavioral. We don't know whether they're just having a good time or not. Sometimes also you see this behavior called belly up, where they turned upside down. Again, it's very difficult to know why they do this. And some of these images with the sperm whales were taken when I was in a boat with just my family and a friend, which meant that I was able to control the situation, and I was able to observe things in a way I couldn't do if there were other people and other photographers who were putting me under pressure to get close to the animals. I often find if you keep a distance, the animals come to you and you can observe a lot of behavior. And it was a similar situation here when we observed some blue whales. Although I was on a big boat with lots of tourists because Minister of Water Sports, because they knew me well and because we had a good whale watching session, they were happy to keep the boat at a distance, and I was able to photograph some unusual behavior, like what's called bubbling. So this is sort of like when a child sort of blows into a straw and creates this bubbling noise, and the parents are going sort of, stop that please, and that sort of thing. Why do whales do this bubbling? And this is not just their usual exhalation of breath. They're creating these bubbles coming out. Again, nobody really knows. Another thing that they do, and it almost seems like they're doing it for fun, is when they come out and bow ride the boats. And that's just an amazing experience to be on a boat and have these animals keeping you company. So the blow or spout is obviously where the animals, because these are mammals, they're to come up and they're to exhale. But the blow is very important for whale watchers for two reasons. Firstly, it gives you a clue that there's an animal out there, and you look for the blow. if you want to whale watch. Secondly, the type of blow tells you what kind of whale it is. So with sperm whales like this one here, it's short and bushy. The single nostril is on the left-hand side and forward pointing. So you get a very characteristic blow, which once you get your eye in, even at a distance, you can tell that it's sperm whale that's a kilometer away, compared to like this blue whale, which has a tall vertical blow. So we've heard of bird waves, and similarly with cetaceans, sometimes you get cetacean waves, and you can have spinners, rhesos, pantropical spotted, and striped dolphins moving together. Sometimes long-filled pilot whales the same, and sometimes bottlenose dolphins join in as well. You're not going to have all the species together. Typically, you might see 2 or 3 species, and here you've got some spinner dolphins traveling with a blue whale. Occasionally, you get some high-speed chases between the big whales. So here, these are 2 blue whales, which I originally mistook for humpback whales because of those big sort of billowing spouts of foam they were creating. The sperm whales are unusual in that the females develop calluses on the dorsal fin and on the dorsal fin, and this is considered a sexual, secondary sexual characteristic. The cetaceans, especially dolphins, form what are called chorus lines, nothing to do with the west end. This is where they travel in sort of long strung out lines. There may be hydrodynamic benefits. It may be easy to feed as well. Then the blue whales do something called flank formation. This is usually when a female comes up and it performs a display. So this is where it sort of rotates the tail, does this very slowly, and then sort of goes beneath the surface, and the male emerges and does something similar. It's very different to the sequence that you will see when they're simply emerging from feeding, resting, breathing, and then diving back down again. And once you've been watching blue whales, you sort of know something different and special is going on, like this flank formation behavior. With the fluking is when they bring their tail up, and as I mentioned before, the behavior of fluking can vary for the same species from one part of the world to another. Sperm whales always fluke, and this could be because they dive deep, and this is how they do it. They just sort of go down vertically, whereas blue whales and other baleen whales, which feed in the top sort of 60 meters or so, descend quite gently. When they do dive, they often leave what's called a fluke print, which you can see here. They also perform what's called a head raise, because these are intelligent animals and they're curious. They come up to the boat and they lift their heads up and have a good look at you. In the case of sperm whales, they also pulse you with sonar. You can hear this underwater, and in the days of wooden ships, the sailors could hear this hammering on the wooden hull, and sperm whales are called carpenter whales because of that. I've also noticed they're very curious when there are children. Maybe they come up and they sonar profile you and they go, "Oh, I think there are man cubs on the boat, how cute." And they come right up, take a look, perhaps they're checking out the children, and then they quietly slip away. Sometimes I do a headstand. This is also called a tail extension. So this is not the normal fluking dive that sort of hold it suspended up. Do the other whales know what they're doing? Does it serve a purpose? Well, we don't know. When they're resting at the surface, this is called logging. And you notice particularly with sperm whales, which looks like a collection of logs sort of drifting on the surface. And sometimes they do what's called porpoising, which is where, especially when they're traveling at speed, they're sort of bounding up and down out of the water. So different species have different mechanisms for dealing with predation. So blue whales will often try to outrun orcas. Chases lasting over 5 to 6 hours have been recorded, and it becomes a case of stamina. Sperm whales often form a wall. Sometimes they form a circle called a Margaret formation. And they use their powerful tails to defend themselves, and they will try and get the young in the center. So this was an exceptional sequence of behavior which was observed and photographed and filmed, and a few of us got together and worked it up into a paper, because surprisingly, even with the large whales, a lot of the behavior has not really been recorded in the scientific literature. Since then, there have been 2 or 3 instances where orcas have been observed hunting sperm whales in Sri Lanka. They also do something called a roll or a pectoral roll, where they sort of rotate longitudinally and they bring their pectoral flippers up. I've seen both sperm whales and blue whales do this. Again, what are they doing here? Are they, does it serve a behavioral purpose, or are they just sort of having a little stretch? We don't know. The other thing the cetaceans show, particularly the larger ones, is sexual dimorphism, where there are pronounced size differences between males and females. What you find is with baleen whales, it's often the case that the females are larger, whereas in toothed whales, like the sperm whales, the males are larger. And in the case of sperm whales, a male could be 50% bigger than a female. However, you could mistake large female sperm whales for a bull whale as well. Sperm whales also do this thing called scrumming, and the best way to describe it is like, imagine a group of schoolboys just sort of pushing each other and having a bit of an argy-bargy in the school playground. And when sperm whales do this, the whole sea seems to turn into a sea of froth. It's quite an amazing sight, and you see how much they're like elephants. The elephants of the sea, there's a lot of touching and a lot of that sort of tactile interaction. They really seem to enjoy that sort of physical connection with each other. Sperm whales also do something called shark fin patrolling, where it seems like they've watched the film Jaws and they're trying to recreate it, and they go around the boat sort of looking very sinister, like a big shark is sort of patrolling around you. Very different to the fluking. And again, what does it do behaviorally? Again, I don't think anybody really has any idea why they're doing that. So we often describe some animals as being social, like when you say 500 spinner dolphins or 1,000, it's easy to describe them as social. We say the blue whales are solitary, but blue whales can communicate across several hundred kilometers using infrasound. So are they really social or solitary? So imagine for a bacteria, which is nanometers apart from other bacteria, when they see a group of humans seated around a dining table, they might look very far away, and the bacteria might think we are solitary animals. In much the same way we think blue whales are solitary, but maybe they're not in terms of how they operate. Another thing the dolphins do is spinning. This could be for fun. It could be to show how fit they are, but it could be for more pragmatic reasons, like trying to remove Remoras. And if you look closely at these pictures, you can see these dolphins have these parasitic Remoras, and they're obviously keen to dislodge them. So I showed earlier that they can close their blowholes to avoid water getting into the lungs. In the case of blue whales, which spend a reasonable amount of time at the surface, they have also developed splash guards to prevent water getting in. Spy hopping is another thing whales do, and the orcas are sort of famous for this. So you can see sperm whales spy hopping here, where they come up and take a good look at you. Cetaceans have a huge number of physiological adaptations for their life, one of which is having microfolds on the skin for the fast-moving species. So this creates what's called laminar flow and allows them to sort of speed through the water quite easily. Superpods of sperm whales are quite rare. In New Zealand, you often just see single bulls. In the zoos, you might have a group of about 8. In Sri Lanka, sometimes you can see 150 sperm whales together. And here's some data I collected to demonstrate why Sri Lanka has the best chance of seeing superpods. It doesn't mean you're going to see them frequently. There are periods of time around March, April when they gather. And after I put out the story, a lot of film crews have gone out there and filmed them. And Wild Sri Lanka, which was based on a book called Wild Sri Lanka, which I worked on, was the basis for a 3-part docu-series. And Mike Burkett Associates went out there and they found the superpods and they were able to film them underwater as well. And lots of other film crews have done that. Another thing the cetaceans do is synchronized diving. So obviously when you've got young with you, that makes sense. The mother and calf will dive together. With adults, this seems to be sort of a follow the leader pattern with the dive sequence. So we've talked about flank formation before. So let's have a quick look at what a whale watching trip will look like. So this sequence is from an actual trip on the 24th of April, leaving from Mirsa in the south. So as you leave, you can see all these fishing boats. Obviously, the area is rich in marine productivity, so the fish are there, the fishermen are there, and the whales and dolphins are out there. And so you find fish hunters like the spinner dolphins in big pods. And as I said before, it's not unusual to see a pod of 500. And you can see them sort of bow riding and spinning and enjoying themselves. And what you're really looking out for on a whale watch are the spouts from blue whales and sperm whales. And you can see this at quite a distance on a clear, calm day. So on this trip, here's a blue whale that got close to us. The land appears to be very close, but actually it's further than you think. And they're used to fishing boats and you know, providing you don't sort of charge towards them, they will on their own volition surface near you. And sometimes you're looking at a whale on one side and suddenly you hear this, and then you look on the other side and you find a blue whale has surfaced right next to you. And this one, I think was making a lunge at krill and it sort of showed its jawline, which it usually doesn't. And we also had sperm whales swimming past the whale watching boats. So this is quite amazing, actually. The blue whale is the largest animal that has ever lived on the planet. And the sperm whale is the largest toothed carnivore on the planet. And to see both on the same trip is quite incredible. And had I chosen to go down to Yala this same day, I could have possibly seen elephant and leopard as well. And if I had finished my whale watching early, I could even done a quick dash into a rainforest on the way. So it's almost like doing a 2-week trip in one day, which is why I emphasize that Sri Lanka is an incredible all-around destination. However, not everything is good on Paradise. In the top picture, I'm showing in the hatched white lines, the shipping lines. These are some of the busiest shipping lines in the world. They have unfortunately been placed close to shore, and they're cutting through the area which is rich in marine life. So the fish are there and the whales and dolphins are there. And because the fish are there, those big red dots you see are fishing boats densities taken from a line transit done by a series of line transits done by Susanna Calderon and her colleagues. And you can see that these container ships are cutting through the fishing fleet. And at night, this is extremely hazardous. There could be 300 fishing craft out there without any radar, and they're just some of them are just wooden boats with a little lantern. The shipping lines have asked for the shipping lines to be moved south. It has not been done yet, and in the bottom picture, you can see that the whale watching boats get dangerously close to the shipping container, the container ships as well. And I think the argument for moving the shipping lines south should be about saving the lives of fishermen and avoiding accidents with whale watching. Good byproduct of that would be that the lives of whales are also saved. If you go to the northwest Kapiti Peninsula, which is the other whale watching site, and let's have a look at an example of another trip. So we set off from Bar Reef. I'm very privileged that people like Dallas Martinstein and his team host me and the family in exchange for me going out and researching some interesting stories. So we set off and we saw Persian shearwater, which was considered a very rare bird, but now we know it's a regular passage migrant. We see things like brown noddy and sperm whales, for which Kapiti is one of the best places. So here's a close-up showing the wrinkly body I referred to before. And because you're in a small boat, you get in your angle of view is very different. You get close, you're low, and you have these sort of dramatic views like this of the sperm whale diving, and you can see that actually its dorsal, the tail fins are quite big as well, although not as big as with the blue whale. And one of the things I do when I see things like sperm whales is I tell the boatman to move away from them and to speed away, go about 1 kilometer in front, cut the engine and wait. And the sperm whales come swimming up, they catch up, several minutes later, and they're curious and they swim up to you. It's like if you go for a walk in a park in London, you find lots of dogs who see you and they come up and they sniff you and they wag their tail and check you out. Sperm whales behave like that at times. So here's sperm whale came closer and closer, and it sort of almost touched the boat, and then it decided, okay, its sonar profiled us, it's happy to leave, and then it dived. Trincomalee is in the northeast, another whale watching hotspot. The Submarine Canyon brings whales so close, you can see blue whales from the beach. So this is a trip again with the family, and again, as I mentioned before, because I was on my own, I was able to control the situation, and I was able to tell the boatman not to approach the whales, to let them do their own thing. And we saw this incredible behavior. It sounded like thunderclaps, and what we were hearing were these whales breaching. And at first I thought this was a male displaying, but it turns out it's the females. The males like to stay in high latitudes. When they're ready for breeding, they come to equatorial waters where the nursery schools are. And the females are so thrilled to see the males. They start putting on a performance, and they go up to the male, and sometimes 6 or 7 of them nuzzling up to the male. So if you believe in reincarnation, like many Buddhists in Sri Lanka do, I guess if you had the choice of animal to be reincarnated as, a male sperm whale seems like a very good choice to me. The sperm whales, like the blue whales, are used to fishing boats. They come and investigate you, and they almost touch the boat. And this picture was taken by my daughter, Amali. It showed a sort of a sperm whale just coming out of the water, lifting itself, having a good look around. So I've nearly talked for 40 minutes. I'm going to speed through the last bit, which is where we look at some birds and other wildlife and look at some of the other places in Sri Lanka you can go to. So I'm going to continue at speed to have everything wrapped up in an hour. Most of the key bird watching sites are in the southwest, because that's where the endemics are. And this map shows some of those sites, starting with Colombo, where you fly into, then you have Singaraja, Horton Plains, and Kitulgala. The Botanist rainforest is only about an hour-and-a-half's drive from Colombo, so you can even do it as a morning trip or spend a day there while you're staying at your hotel in Colombo. Singaraja is a few hours away. And Kitulgala is, just go back. Kitulgala is intermediate in altitude, And on the right-hand side, you see Horton Plains National Park, which is up in the mountains. You might not think of Colombo as a great place. Certainly, I don't think there are very many Sri Lankans who appreciate that it's a fantastic place for wildlife. It's also like a capital for the fishing cat, and it's got a number of wetlands which are fairly well managed. There's Diasaru Wetland Park, and you can see things like purple-faced leaf monkey in suburban Colombo. You have Bathagana Wetland, which the consulting arm of the Wildfowl and Wetland Trust were involved in setting up. And you have the Talangama Wetland, which is just another suburb of Colombo, although the marsh itself is protected for water retention. And when I lived there, I would sometimes go early in the morning to the wetland, take some amazing pictures like this, and then drive off to office. I didn't even have to leave the house because endemic birds like the Ceylon small barbet is found in Colombo. So is this endemic woodpecker, which you see when you walk around. And in places like Talangama, you get this endemic swallow, the Ceylon swallow, which has been split from the red-rump swallow. You also get amazing animals like the water monitor. This is the second largest lizard in the world. Looks terrifying, but actually it's quite wary of people and will move away. You can also see lots of dragonflies and butterflies, even in central Colombo, in one of these wetlands. If you go on a visit, you can see more than 30 species sometimes. And well, I needed to sort of get my head around the butterflies and dragonflies. So this is a book I worked on again with John Beaufoy Publishing, so that I could make sense of all this amazing riches that even a capital city like Colombo has to offer the wildlife enthusiasts. The serious birders take in Kitulgala rainforest, which is sort of in the not quite high up in the highlands, but at mid elevations. And they also take in Singaraja, which has these tall dipterocarp trees. 51 or 52 species of dipterocarps are endemic to Sri Lanka, and tropical dipterocarp rainforests, which are predominant in Asia, are taller in stature than what you see in the Amazon, for example. Singaraja has the Singaraja birdway, which is very famous because it's the largest in size of bird waves. It's also the longest studied. 59 species have been recorded, and the average flock size is 41. And quite often you can see anything from half a dozen to a dozen endemic species in a group. The spotpin thrush, which is a beautiful singer, doesn't really join bird waves, but it's one of the first birds you hear. Its relative to scaly thrush is considered by some to be endemic. Others consider it as part of the white thrush complex. It's a much harder bird to see, but it's got a good distribution from the lowlands all the way up in the mountains. Probably the star bird for many people is the endemic Ceylon blue magpie, a stunningly beautiful bird. The rufous babbler is not the most colorful of birds, but it's very important because it's the nucleus species for the Singaraja bird wave and for many of the mixed species flocks you will see in the rainforest. And if you want to see the endemic birds, you listen out for the Ceylon rufous babbler. Then you also begin to see things like the ashy-headed laughing thrush, another endemic, but more discreet, stays very much on the undergrowth. You're quite likely to hear the Ceylon scimitar babbler. It's got this beautiful call. And when they sing, they do it. The male sings a sequence, and then the female, which likes to get the last word in, adds the last note. The Greenville Cuckoo is a very threatened endemic found in just a handful of sites. It is a cuckoo, and as you can see, the cuckoos are quite diverse. So on the bottom right, you have the European cuckoo and the common cuckoo, which is actually photographed in England. And then going up, you see the Circia malcoha, which is unlike the other malcohas, is largely a ground-dwelling bird. Then you have things like the Jacobin cuckoo and the cuckoos, all in this sort of diverse scientific order, Cuculiformes. The red-faced malcoha is one of the most desired cuckoos, quite a shy, unobtrusive bird found in the canopy. But while you're looking for the endemic birds, obviously it makes sense to look at some of these small mammals as well. So on the top row, you have the dusky squirrel and the layered squirrel, two endemics. Bottom right is the endemic red slender loris. You need to do some night walks with the red lights of that. The giant squirrel is not an endemic and it's easy to see. It's also good to look out for other interesting stuff. 18 out of 21 agate lizards in Sri Lanka are found nowhere else in the world. And you see quite a few of these as you're out bird watching. When you go up in the mountains, everything changes, of course. It's cooler and it's misty. And you have elfin forest. So in this picture, you're looking out and the triangular peak you see at the back is Adam's Peak, which is religious significance to many Sri Lankan communities. Horton National Park is a very precious and fragile habitat. The trees are festooned with mosses and lichens, and some of the plants in the canopy actually take their moisture from the mist that travels through them. The animals here are different. So the bear monkey is actually a subspecies of the purple-faced leaf monkey. The one at these altitudes is much sort of shaggier. There are good numbers of sambar, which means it supports good numbers of leopards. Although it falls to sub-zero during the night, you have endemic lizards like the black-lipped lizard, also seen up there. And the characteristic audio signature of the highlands is from this bird, the endemic yellow-fronted barbet. Not so exciting, but important for the birders is Ceylon wood pigeon, another endemic bird. And one of the hardest to find is the Ceylon whistling thrush. Looks quite drab, but if you look at it through ultraviolet, the patterns are very different, and they evolve for other birds of the same species, which can see in ultraviolet to make out the patterns in the dark dense habitats that they're found. It's in the Musicapidae, the same as the robin, but whistling thrush won't pass up a good vertebrate like a lizard or a frog when it gets a chance. The Ceylon bush warbler is quite unique. It's the only member of its genus and very much confined to the highlands. And the Ceylon white-eye is largely found in the highlands as well, but it's quite an abundant bird. There is a sister species, but it turns out they're not sister species in that one didn't evolve from the other. They're from different immigrations from the mainland. And white-eyes are known as a sort of a super speciator because they colonize island groups, spread out and become new species. There's also an endemic flycatcher, which is found in the highlands, the dusky blue, which is a beautiful song, reminds you a little bit of a blackbird. If you go into the dry lowlands in the southeast, you have Yala National Park, where you have all the big stuff like the leopards. Sri Lanka is now very well known as a destination for leopards, but in 2001, when I began to popularize this with jetwing, there was a lot of skepticism, but that's another story. What you need to know is that because it's a top predator, they're quite relaxed and you get some amazing viewings. There are great opportunities, some lovely photography. Especially now, people are getting some great images because the density of vehicles has fallen. This is a sequence of cubs playing. They're very relaxed even during the day because there's no other big sort of land predator. Their biggest threat is crocodiles when they're drinking water. There are other predators, of course, like the golden jackal, which has a interesting sort of life cycle with an alpha pair usually bringing up the young. There are other smaller mammals which are beautiful, like the badger mongoose, one of 4 species. Probably one of the most dangerous animals to encounter is the sloth bear, which is a semi-specialist. It rips open concrete-like tough termite mounds, and they have long, powerful claws, which can inflict heavy damage if you startle one. The national parks in Asia are generally not so good for seeing mammals, like in Africa, where you have a number of ungulates out on the open plains. But Yala, due to a combination of factors, is actually quite good as far as Asian parks go for seeing mammals. Close to Yala, again on the southeast, is Bundala National Park. It's not so good for large mammals, but it's incredible for waders and things. If you go to the north central province, again in the dry lowlands, you have Minera and Kaudulla. One of the nice things is here you have a number of hotels like the Cinnamon Lodge Haburana and Villuina, which are more like sort of small nature reserves. And these are all just taken on the grounds of the hotel while I was working on a book on trees, but it's easy to get distracted with all the wildlife there is. Villuina is another example inspired by the London Wetland Trust, their work on the London Wetland Centre. And it has, as it matured, attracted a lot of interesting animals like otters, rusty spotted cats, and jungle cats. But the big draw here is the Minera and Kaudulla National Park, where you have the elephant gathering. This is the largest seasonally recurring gathering of wild elephants in the world, something which, thanks to the record keeping habits I had acquired with the London Natural History Society, etc. I had made notes and I realized something special was happening, and I publicized it as the gathering. Again, a lot of film crews have now sort of filmed this, one of the big animal spectacles of the planet. And it really is remarkable because you get so close to elephant families and you see so much of behavior. You see the big bulls sort of coming during the peak of the gathering from about June, July, August, September. And as the lake sort of recedes during the dry season, the bed turns to grassland, so the elephants have water and grass and social interaction. And for the birders, you could be watching 100 wild elephants on one side, and you can also do a bit of bird watching by looking towards the lake. In the northeast is another dry zone park, not too far from Kaudulla and Minera as the crow flies. This park is famous for its sort of villus or shallow lakes. Again, it benefits from a number of little lodges, which are almost like little nature reserves. And this is backwaters, which I believe Conroy stayed in as well. And although I was focused on photographing trees, I couldn't help getting distracted by all the wildlife that was in the premises of the lodge. And I was actually working on a book on trees because I needed a book that helped me put a name to things. Sri Lanka seems to have a bewildering variety of native trees, perhaps 800 species. But once you learn the trees, you find that in a dry zone national park, if you know 15 to 20 trees, you're able to put a name to a lot of the flora you see around you. Wilpattu also has good numbers of barking deer or the Indian muntjac. This is not the Chinese or Reeves's muntjac that you see in Britain. And preying on them is the leopard, which Wilpattu is also very famous for. Not far from Wilpattu on the northwest is this island called Mana. So the island and the adjoining mainland area is an internationally important wetland. A big game changer for Mana was Palmyra House, which is very conservation oriented and provided a base for bird watchers, and they're also sponsoring a lot of research. The area is especially good for watching gulls, and you see birds like the Huglin's gull, which has traveled 6,500 kilometers to reach Sri Lanka. It's also very good for large numbers of waterfowl. There's a string of sand islands connecting the northern peninsula connecting sort of from the area around Manna Island to India. And these are the breeding grounds of a number of scarce species like the brown noddy, the roseate tern, and the sooty tern. So if you were to try and build sort of some overland connection between India and Sri Lanka, you would actually build it from Manna rather than from the very tip of the northern peninsula. The East Coast is also very good. A number of national parks like Lahogana and Kumana. Recently, they've also come up with developments like the Ugrana River Safari, which allows you to get close to water birds. You may see 50 or more species on one of these boat trips. And also you encounter what you might mistake to be a local politician in the bottom image, but that's actually one of the marsh crocodiles, which are actually quite harmless to people. They sort of leave you well alone. In this area, on the eastern side is Lahogala National Park, which is interesting because it's what's known as intermediate forest. It has tall forests and beautiful old trees. And because the tree cover is so good, the rather reticent red-faced small-cohort is also seen here. So I think I'm sort of, I was given an hour. I think I managed to cover it in 59 minutes. So I'd like to end with this slide. And once again, just saying thank you to a huge number of people in Sri Lanka who are better acknowledged in my books for all the support they have given me to share with other people my excitement at what a great wildlife destination that Sri Lanka is. And thank you once again for the invitation. I will stop sharing now so that then we can give the presentation back to Jack.
Thank you, Gehan. I'll hand over to Andrew.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me. I've managed to come off. You're spared seeing me. So questions, please, for Gehan.
People can either unmute themselves to ask a question or put their hands up to indicate that they want to ask a question, or they can submit the question via the chat function.
I was going to ask Gehan to explain bird waves. I think I started to pick up what he was on about, but I was not familiar with that term.
Yeah, so I mean, bird waves are another term for mixed species feeding flocks. And bird wave is a term that's, I think, more commonly used in the tropics, but it's the same thing that you see, even in Britain. I think the bird waves are more pronounced in Britain in winter when you find things like blue-tit, grey-tit, long-tailed tit, tree creeper, goldcrest, sort of all moving together.
Could I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Are there marine protected areas in Sri Lanka? And if so, do they benefit dolphins and whales, being such large animals? Or when thinking about them, do they travel too far to make marine protected areas worthwhile from their point of view?
That's a very interesting question. So Sri Lanka doesn't have a network of MPAs in the sense you have them around Britain. However, there are a number of marine national parks, a small number like Hikkaduwa Marine National Park. These are actually brought in to protect the coral reefs. So they're sort of more like sort of inshore national parks. With the marine mammals, they're actually protected all around the island. So if you visited a fish market 20, 30 years ago, you would have found that there was cetacean bycatch available for sale. But for perhaps 20 or 30 years now, the catching of marine mammals is prohibited. So in terms of the marine mammals, they're protected all around Sri Lanka. And presently, even if you wanted to swim with them, whether it's for photography or for, just as a swim with whales experience, you would need permits. And at present, Sri Lanka doesn't sort of permit a swim with whales experience. It's, the underwater filming is really for either for research or for a permissioned film shoot. So on paper, the protection is quite good, but I think there's more work that needs to be done, because you still find fishermen will throw in a stick of dynamite for catching fish, which is enormously destructive. You also have unsustainable practices like to supply the Chinese market. You find rays and skates killed in very large numbers, and sometimes very wastefully, because they only sort of killing the animal just to harvest just one particular body part of the animal. So there's a lot of lobbying going on locally to tighten the protection that's already there.
Do you think that will happen anytime soon?
Well, I heard Daniel Fernando giving a presentation on the lobbying they're doing for improving protection for sharks, rays, and skates, and it sounds quite promising. I think they had almost got there when COVID came and there was lockdowns and change of government and all sorts of things happen. But generally, there is a lot of appetite in Sri Lanka for environmental protection by the public. So fingers crossed it'll happen in the next few years.
I think we've got 3 questions submitted via chat. Andrew, Tony, Andrew, do you want to do it?
No, okay, yes. So the 3 questions were, I'll tell you them and then you can take your time with them. Are any of the whales endangered? Are Sri Lanka's cuckoos parasitic like our cuckoo in quotes? And is there a conflict between local villages and the large predators?
Yeah, so on the first one, I know the whales endangered species. I think the larger ones are because a lot of these animals don't really obviously respect national boundaries, so that they're quite international in behavior. And if a species is internationally considered endangered, that label would therefore apply in Sri Lanka as well. The blue whales are a special case because it's considered a subspecies. I mean, they're potentially 5 or 6 subspecies, although genetically the idea of subspecies is not that well supported. So the blue whale you find in Sri Lanka is called the sort of Indian Ocean blue whale, Balenopterus musculus indica. Its population was decimated by illegal Soviet whaling in the early second half of the 20th century. So we don't really have a very good handle on the numbers, but like Georgina and Jamal, whom I referred to earlier, was also doing a blue whale photo study, and she identified around 90 individuals. So at the moment, it's still sketchy as to how many individuals are out there. So that's, it's definitely an endangered population. But most cetacean species, I think the numbers have declined dramatically due to, very bad fishing practices like using seine nets, which would capture thousands of these animals and they would drown because, they are air-breathing mammals. So I think most of them would fall into one of the IUCN categories. One exception might be the spinner dolphins, which are in good numbers. On the next question on, do Sri Lankan cuckoos invade other species' nests like the British cuckoos? They definitely do. This seems to be pretty much characteristic of the cuckoo family. So in Colombo, you have something called the Asian quail, which is a common bird. You often see the crows chasing it away because it even mimics the crow egg, light blue with chocolate splotches, and you get used to sort of telling the eggs apart because the quail's egg is more pointy, but the crows can't tell the difference. But there's also some interesting mimicry that's taking place. So Gabriel Jamie, who attends some of the RSPB talks and the London Bird Club talks, lead authored a paper based on some observations I had done, where I noticed, I heard a young Jacobin cuckoo calling, but I mistook it for a yellow-billed babbler. And it took me a while before I realized something was different. And then I saw the yellow-billed babblers feeding it. And so this is a case where they have even evolved not just egg mimicry, but they're mimicking the vocalizations of the host. Then we did another paper because I came across another example of it. I was in the Botanist rainforest, and I heard what I thought was an endemic crested drongo calling, and I didn't pay that much attention. And then again, I noticed something was slightly different. And then I looked at what it was, and it was a cuckoo, and I was able to audio recorded it, and just about got a second on video before it flew off. And again, Gabriel sort of worked it up to paper because this is, again, yet another interesting example of this sort of evolution between the brood parasite and the host. On the third question, is there much conflict between local villages and the large predators like leopard? There is human leopard conflict on the rise, not because they're sort of taking humans. Fortunately, we don't have man-eating leopards in Sri Lanka. But what you find is that they go after in the livestock. So in the southeast, one group has started a project where they donate sort of cages, large sort of cages where you can put your goats and cattle in the night to protect them from leopards. And in the highlands where, leopard can be seen a few hundred meters away from highland cities like Nurelia, you find they come and take dogs. So again, there's conflict. And I remember, and there's a big city called Kandy in the central hills, in the mid hills. I've heard reliable reports of people driving back at midnight and sort of seeing a leopard that's coming to the lake in the middle of the city to have a drink of water before going back up to the forest. So it's obviously exciting for wildlife enthusiasts like us to know that you have leopards close to the city, but it does create conflict.
Thank you. Nick?
Hello. I just wanted to know how much the pandemic and the loss of tourism has affected the maintenance and the general health of all your fantastic reserves.
So I think the pandemic, obviously, it shut down foreign tourism, but in terms of the maintenance, from what I've been hearing from my friends as to going out into the parks when local regulations permit it, I haven't really heard anything amiss about the lack of maintenance. Because other than a few lockdown periods, the people employed in the government service have been back at work. The local wildlife enthusiasts seem to be enjoying the absence of a lot of tourist jeeps sort of inside the parks. And there are some absolutely amazing clips on social media of people photographing leopards sort of trying to pick off buffalo calves, and people are filming amazing things on their phones now because the visitor traffic has reduced. Anyway, the issue of sort of visitor management is a different topic in itself, and there's a lot of discussion about how to do it in a way that it's good for tourism and it's good for the wildlife as well. So far, I think things seem to be holding up okay from what I'm hearing.
I think I'm right in saying, Gehan, that most of Sri Lanka's endemic bird species are in the rainforest in the southwest, and that my understanding is that habitat is quite limited, and so I wonder how much of a threat there is to some of these endemics.
Yes, that's correct, Chegg. The majority of the endemics are confined to the southwest, where you have the rainforest sort of all the way from lowland to altitudinally graded to the cloud forest in the highlands. And unfortunately, this is the area that has lost a lot of its forest cover. So what we have left is a small fragment of what was there before. But still, fortunately, there are big enough patches that if these are protected, the endemics will sort of manage to hold out. I think what Sri Lanka really needs is more ambitious sort of rewilding projects to take place. So that there is talk of sort of upgrading the protected status of some of the forests, which are sort of more like proposed forest reserves rather than gazetted inviolate sort of forest reserves. Something that has concerned the conservation community is that what are called other state forests are under threat of being degazetted and being opened up for development. A lot of these are in the dry lowlands, but nevertheless, wherever they are, protection needs to be sort of enhanced. And in the case of the rainforest, I mean, it's obviously not easy to regenerate lost rainforest, but I think that's what Sri Lanka really needs to be doing. There have been attempts to sort of rehabilitate degraded hillsides with cloud forest, and that has worked. Rohan Pityagoda did something like this about 20 years ago or 30 years ago, and he won a Rolex award for that. So we just hope that the private sector and the public sector will collaborate to do that. There's a leopard project led by Andrew Kettle and Anjali Watson, where they're talking with private landholders to create sort of corridors so that the highland leopards can move around. And obviously the next logical step is to encourage some of those private landholders to rehabilitate rainforests so that over the next 50 to 100 years, we will actually build up the rainforest cover that is present.
Thank you. Well, I've got another one I'd like to ask.
Go
I'm
ahead.
interested in your comments in response to one of the questions, Gehan, regarding leopards. You said in Sri Lanka we don't have man-eating leopards. Yeah, I find that's interesting to me because it might not be very widespread, but leopards do occasionally take humans in India, particularly I think younger people, like say 10 or 11-year-old. So why not in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Because I mean, India is famous for having had some very savage man-eating leopards, which took a lot of victims. Sri Lanka has only one reliably recorded man-eater, the man-eater of Punane. About 10 years ago, there was a woman who was attacked by a leopard and she was killed. But they think that it was more a case that the leopard was startled and killed her in self-defense rather than stalking her to eat her. And it could be that, in India with the man-eaters, tigers and leopards, one hypothesis was that because, human dead were left out sort of as part of the burial rites without, burying them or cremating them, some of these animals acquired a taste for flesh. Sometimes it was because of the hunting, and they were injured. So in Sri Lanka, you will never find human remains being left out anywhere. They're almost always buried or cremated. So that is one sort of risk factor that is eliminated. There is illegal hunting of leopards, but it's not sort of widespread. There is a bit of laying out of snares, and leopards occasionally get caught, but I think those animals are sort of, if they do free themselves, they will die very quickly. So I think the underlying contributory factors that make them man-eater are probably very much lower than in India, which might explain why.
Okay. So I can get out of my Jeep in Yala National Park and in front of a leopard and it won't attack me.
Well, if it's been reading the guidelines set out by the Sri Lanka Tourism Promotion Bureau to be friendly to tourists, it won't. Well, I've been on foot and I've encountered leopards, and they have left me alone, and I've spoken to other researchers who've encountered leopards, and I think the leopards sort of tend to give you distance and space if they're not startled.
Okay, great.
Probably the most dangerous animal in Sri Lanka is the water buffalo, because you walk past a water hole, you don't see anything in there except maybe a branch sticking out, but that's a water buffalo with its horns sort of covered in mud, and they come and go you from behind. So yeah, you just have to be very careful.
Right, we had a question as to whether we'll be sharing the presentation.
Yes.
Yes, is the answer. Right, good. Okay, I think I'm going to wind up unless people are leaping forward with questions. So by way of conclusion, I think we might have an announcement or two in a minute, so don't scoot off immediately. But first of all, I'd like to thank Gehan for giving such a wide-ranging and informative presentation. It was really good, so thank you.